It gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Avtar Singh Bhasin, former colleague in MEA, who has written a new book on India and Pakistan, India and Pakistan, Neighbours at Odds. And, Bhasin Saab has done something which is quite a remarkable service for, not just for us, but for the entire research community and a place like ORF, for example. Because what he started out initially was to try and put together an authoritative resource which would contain all the official documents that have been exchanged. He's done that with our neighbors particularly, which is, I think, one of the most outstanding things. And having been in the neighborhood, I can tell you that his volumes are something that we would always go back to in the embassies to look at for the authentic version of whether it was something, a letter that had been exchanged in 1953 or agreement that had been initialed in 1948 or anything like that. But other than that, Pakistan is an abiding passion, or shall I say obsession, with Bhasin Saab. And this new book is actually a complete sweep of history in terms of covering the scope of India-Pakistan relations. Not only that, I mean, alongside we have Ambassador Lamba, I think, who needs no introduction, has served in Pakistan, has been Joint Secretary dealing with handling Pakistan for a number of years, has been Prime Minister's Special Envoy dealing with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so on, was the back channel during Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh's time, and remains actively engaged in terms of relations with Pakistan. Professor Riaz Punjabi, former Vice Chancellor, University of Kashmir, again, somebody who has written extensively on our neighborhood foreign policy and Pakistan. Suhasini Haider, who's Deputy Resident Editor for The Hindu and has traveled to Pakistan, has commented on affairs both internal in Pakistan as well as India-Pakistan relations. And of course, I have Kriti here, who has been plowing through this book diligently, one of our young scholars at ORF. And so let me, first of all, invite you, Bhasin Saab, to talk about the book. And after that, we will go as with Ambassador Lamba, then Professor Punjabi, Suhasini, and Kriti. Bhasin Saab.
Thank you, everybody. Right at the beginning, let me thank ORF for organizing this discussion and to Ambassador Rakesh Sood for chairing it. To Ambassador Lamba, Professor Riyad Punjabi, and Mrs. Suhasini Haider, I say a big thank you for their agreeing to be panelists. To all of you present here, I say a hearty welcome and express my gratitude for your presence here. I take pleasure in introducing my latest book, India-Pakistan Neighbours at Odds, published by Bloomsbury. The book is a follow-up by 10-volume publication of documents accessed from the archives of the Ministry of External Affairs, containing 3,650 documents running into 10,000 pages. And many more documents accessed from the Nehru collection housed in the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, which I got to see after the earlier publication. Coming to the subject, Pakistan at the birth was both in size and resources smaller country than India, and that influenced the narrative for most part of the story of India-Pakistan relations. To overcome this asymmetry, it tried to make up through military aid and alliances. It gave it a false sense of confidence that it could now meet the challenge of bigger state if ever there was one. It insisted that India was a Hindu state without realizing that the second largest Muslim numbers lived in India and not in the Islamic state which it claimed to be. The secession of East Pakistan in 1971 gave proof that religion does not make nations. Nations are made by cultural cohesiveness, bonds of language, common legacy and history. The unrest and upsurge in Balochistan for independence is again a proof of the same factors which gave East Pakistan its Bangladesh. Pakistan, born in 1997, was a geographic entity and not a nation. Pakistan continues to accuse India for breakup of East Pakistan, using the constitutional crisis in East Pakistan as a pretext and therefore it must pay back India in the same coin. That explains to a great extent its support to the Khalistani movement and insurgency in Punjab in the 80s and its continued support to separatists in Kashmir. Indian independence propagated the idea that the newly emerging countries of Asia and Africa, which had suffered colonial rule for a century or two, must safeguard their independence by steering clear of the Cold War politics of the big powers. The contradictions between the two perceptions created problems between them. It was a case of history casting its dubious shadows on the contemporary realities which were no more steeped in history of the past. Pakistan repeatedly rejected Indian assurances of its territorial integrity by offer of a no-war declaration. Well, whether India likes it or not, Kashmir for Pakistan remained the core issue to be settled between India and Pakistan. As the narrative in the book bears it out, the entire discourse of the last 7 decades has revolved around Kashmir and it has remained frozen in foreign policy discourse of Pakistan. Pakistan carried its grouse against India around the world and at every handshake never failed to rake up the issue. India, however, believes it was only a symptom of bigger malice Pakistan suffered from. India's suo decision to ascertain the wishes of people of people of Jammu and Kashmir as to their future and through the UN supervised vote and finally taken the issue to the United Nations and again offering to hold the plebiscite and agreeing to make the UN responsible for the conduct gave the aggressor Pakistan a toehold in the stage, thereby catapulting a domestic issue into international domain and also making it an issue of Cold War politics. Much before the ceasefire was declared on January 1, 1949, Nehru had met Liaquat Ali Khan on October 1948 on the sidelines of the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference in London and offered Liaquat to keep what Pakistan had grabbed and end the war. He rejected it for obvious reason that given the religious profile of the state, the whole of it would fall into Pakistan's lap through plebiscite. Such an offer at the negotiating table for a peaceful peace settlement would have seemed reasonable. But the offer, when the war was going on, tantamounted to surrender and exposed India's weakness. India's biggest failure in Kashmir lies in the fact that it has allowed alienation to seep among the vociferous sections of the state who are young and educated without corresponding employment opportunities to absorb them in productive activities. The state's ruling elite who ruled the state for 70 years neither promoted industry nor business, nor created climate for their promotion. The archaic rules that govern the state policies on investment are no less impediment to even domestic investments. The leaders who dominated the state's political scene in the last 70 years are the real guilty men for their failure to promote these activities. The fractious politics of the country has also prevented and continues to prevent a national consensus on the state. Pakistan has found the ground fertile for its shenanigans. Let me draw your attention to the issues which continue to cause problems in the state. That Sheikh Abdullah was behaving erratically much before his arrest in August 1953 is well known. To placate him, Nehru had gone to great lengths in the hope that it would help remove his wrinkles from his face and chime with his wishes so that both could speak in one voice. Under the existing rules, notified in 1927, only permanent residents of the state were eligible for citizenship rights in the state. He wanted to end this anomaly by which thousands of partition refugees settled in the state, taking it part of India, were discriminated. Nehru was keen that the people of the state should have only one citizenship like people of the rest of the country. He wanted to use the meeting which was scheduled with Sheikh Abdullah in July 1952 to end this anomaly. Before the meeting, in a note on July 3, Nehru put on certain minimums which must be met while arguing in favor of certain flexibility in the Indian Constitution to give a special treatment to the state. The first of these minimums was there can be only one common nationality or citizenship, namely that of the Republic of India, and that there cannot be any kind of separate citizenship or dual citizenship. The Sheikh would have nothing of this, and finally Nehru considered, agreed to that, and I quote, the state legislature to define and regulate the privileges of the permanent residents of the state. The past practice got a fresh lease of life and sanctity, and the result is that not only the partition refugees and their children born in the state, but also Kashmiri women marrying outside the state with Indian citizens were also deprived of citizenship rights in the state. To give effect to this understanding of daily agreement, Article 35A was introduced in the Constitution by a presidential order. It is this explosive question that the Supreme Court is now adjudicating. There are other minimums as well that he had listed in the July 3 note, like the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court or supremacy of the Indian Constitution over that of the state, or the financial integration of the state with that of the Union or authority of the President. All these were not accepted by the Sheikh. The more Nehru compromised, the more obstinate Sheikh grew, and the distance between the state and the Union went on increasing. Ultimately, he had to be arrested. Nehru claimed that he was not aware of the arrest, and it was the decision of the Sadr Riyasat. If one were to read the letter between the lines that Nehru wrote to the president on the 9th of August, and he was arrested on the 8th, certain doubts do creep in. Nehru, of course, maintained the same position with Sheikh Abdullah when he met him after his release in April 1964. But Sheikh was unbelieving. His long detention had made him so bitter that he told Nehru, and I quote, almost everyone in Kashmir disliked India and was in favor of Pakistan. India was to them an outside power which was controlling them and imposing its will on them. He was convinced that the problem of Kashmir would not be settled till some arrangement with Pakistan was made. He insisted, however, that it remained a troubled spot and uneasy about its future, and little progress could be made there. He did not accept Nehru's claim that the state had made progress in the intervening year. For Nehru, Kashmir remained the symbol of Indian secularism. He feared that the position of Muslims in India would be compromised if status quo was disturbed. He had gone to Karachi in 1960 to sign the Indus Water Treaty. While discussing Kashmir, he told you, the only practical sensible course was to allow the matter to rest where they were, more or less, and accept the position as it was. He expressed his oft-repeated fears that any change in the status quo would have unsettling effect both in India and Pakistan, and the Muslim would injuriously suffer. He further told Ayub, and I quote, we have a large population of Muslims in India, and on the whole, they have been integrated. But any wrong step taken by us would affect them injuriously and prevent further integration. He was therefore afraid interfering with the status quo in any direction would make the position of the Muslims in India untenable and also lead to a fresh wave of migration, upsetting the peace between the two countries. There are many number of such dichotomies that emerge from the pages of this book. Please allow me to relate an important fact before I finish. After the Chinese nuclear test in 1964, and later when NPT was under discussion, India seriously considered whether to make a bomb or not, or how to take care of its security against any nuclear attack or even nuclear blackmail. L.K. Jha, who was then the principal secretary to the Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, a note to her said that the Chinese threat was partly military and partly ideological. Arguing the ideological aspect and expressing his personal view, he said, the cost of India going nuclear is so high in material terms that we shall lose the ideological battle against China in the process. To put it briefly, we cannot, with our limited resources, follow China's footsteps in the nuclear field without also adopting the Chinese way of life politically and economically. As a follow-up of this, External Affairs Minister M.C. Chagla, L.K. Jha, and Foreign Secretary C.R. Jha separately visited Moscow, Washington, London, and Paris to see if the nuclear powers would give a collective guarantee against nuclear blackmail or nuclear threat. The assessment of the end was, I quote, neither the USA nor the USSR would subscribe to a statement which in legal terms amounted to taking on indefinite, unlimited liabilities beyond the UN Charter. It was later clarified that in asking for collective security, India did not give any assurances that it would sign the NPT. I think I should stop here since there are too many episodes to talk about and I can go on and on. As for instance, why India spurned the Soviet offer of a treaty of peace and friendship in 1950 or 1951. I have I leave that for all of you to read in the book leisurely. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Vasim Saab. I think that was very good insight. And I think both on the nuclear side as well as on the interaction between Pandit Nehru and Sheikh Abdullah, very fascinating insights. May I now request Ambassador Lamba?
Mr. Rakesh Sood, Mr. Avtar Singh Bhasin, Suhasini, Professor Riaz Punjabi, and many friends that I see here. Firstly, I'm the only one here who is not carrying my book with me, but that doesn't mean I haven't read it. I want to assure you I've read it cover to cover because Avtar Singh Ji was kind to present me with a copy after it came out, and I read it cover to cover. And there are so many things written in it. It is a follow-up of his 10-volume masterpiece, which came in 2012, which is based on archival material, the 10 volumes. So this book also has his views. So naturally, when the author's views comes, at times there are some differences, and I always believe that there should be place for dissent, and because if two people agree, then one becomes unnecessary. It's an excellent book, and as archival material is concerned, I just want to tell you, a few days ago, Suhasini asked me to do a piece on Mr. Vajpayee's foreign policy. And I had about 2 hours to do it, and after I had completed it, I wanted a quotation. I said, where do I get it? I said, I thought I saw it in Bhasin Saab's book. And lo and behold, I opened it and I got it. This was Mr. Vajpayee's meeting, first meeting with the Pakistan ambassador after he took over as foreign minister. I call him ambassador because at that time Pakistan was not in the in the Commonwealth. And I quoted it in the article and sent it to Suhasini. Anyhow, my congratulations to him because I think very few people could bring out a kind of thing that he has done. You know, time is short. I have about 10 minutes because each one of us, I find 3 of us have. So I will just touch 2 or 3 aspects of the book. It's not possible to speak on all of them. Let me first of all take up the issue of the partition. He writes a lot about partition, and I have some idea of partition in different parts of the world. I myself came here as a 6-year-old refugee, and when my mother went to admit me in a school in Simla, the address, she immediately gave a Peshawar address, and then she stopped. She said, no, the address is the Dimples, Simla. That was the rented house of my uncle where I was staying. And I could see she was very upset that we didn't have an address. It didn't make much sense to me. 30 years later, when she built a house, and I didn't realize, she told me, now you have an address. She did remember that I was perturbed at something at that time. So I passed. Then I opened the Indian mission in Bangladesh, saw partition there. I went as ambassador to United Germany just a few years after the unification and saw the impact of unification and then I went as ambassador to Russia. I had earlier served there in the Soviet Union and saw the impact of partition. So I've seen it all over. But here, as Mr. Bhasin mentions, that Pakistan emerged as a geographic entity and not as a nation in 1947. He mentions it in the book, and he also mentioned it just now, how right he is. In the book, he mentions that Pakistan inherited 23% of the landmass and 17% of the population. In another book written by Asha Jalal, The Struggle for Pakistan, she mentions that Pakistan inherited 33% of the armed forces and 77% and 17% of the resources. And according to her, that was one reason why the army became so strong there. And I think it is in Mr. Bhasin's book that he mentions that the Pakistan civilian leaders, Liaquat and Jinnah, were imported in my words, not his, into Pakistan because they came from Karachi and Liaquat from the non-Punjabi part of Punjab, Kathal. Whereas the army leaders, Ayub and co., were based from the areas that formed part of Pakistan, and so did the Pakistan Armed Forces. And so this is how the whole thing started with partition. Now, as I told you, I will be only dealing with 2 or 3 aspects in these 10 minutes. I've already taken 4. Next, I come to what Bhasin Saab calls the document, the Indo-Soviet Treaty. He has written based on the material, archive material, that in 1969, for the first time, the Soviets made the suggestion for a treaty, and it was called, always referred to confidentially as the document. There was reluctance in India at that time to accept it because it was felt that our strategic autonomy will be affected. Strategic autonomy is not the word that he has used in the book. He has said that our relations with West and other Mrs. Gandhi felt would be affected. So not much, she instructed people to slow down. However, developments in Bangladesh, as they developed, India's attitude changed. And he refers to 2 people, officials who played an important role in the treaty, Pegov and Fomin. I have met both of them. In fact, I saw off Ambassador Pegov with my ambassador Keval Singh sometime in August, September 1968 when he came to Delhi to take over his post. And my last meeting with him was on New Year's Day, that I remember, 1972, just after the war, in the house of Foreign Secretary T.N. Kaul, where celebrations of the victory were being done over vodka and dadna. Incidentally, I left his house at about 1 in the morning, and naturally I was sleeping at 10:30 when there was a call from his faithful private secretary N.B. Menon, who was always his conscience keeper, saying, "Kahan hai? Saab yaad kar rahe hain." The message was that the foreign secretary was in office after having had vodka at night till 12. So I reached there at 3:30 in the foreign secretary's office. He said, "Should I say good morning or good afternoon to you?" I said, "Well," anyhow, he was just, he was not being naughty, he was just being, that he was in the office. There was nothing important. But Fomin, in my days, was the Secretary General in the Foreign Office. Secretary General was a junior office, and since it's been done away with, it was less than a deputy. And later he came as ambassador to Bangladesh, the second Soviet ambassador. Their first ambassador was their consul general. So these were the 2. But finally, the treaty was signed on 9th August. But the main spirit behind the treaty, the support from the treaty came from the Soviet Defense Ministry. And in those years, they were not looking at Pakistan. They were looking at China. Marshal Grechko, as the book says, and on different occasions told Ambassador Dhar and others that we will, in a way, we'll take care of that border for you. You don't worry. And now, the day the treaty was signed, Pravda, as the book says, came out with an article saying that this will prevent any mischievous dealing by China and Pakistan. And Pravda in those days was what was the final word. I have served in Soviet Union in the 60s. One day my ambassador came from the Foreign Office and was very happy. He said, you know, I was working as a special assistant. He says, today Firubin was Deputy Foreign Minister and husband of the famous Furseva, the member of the Politburo. He said, today he told me something which was beyond the Pravda. So Pravda was, and the Pravda article is significant. But what is important, the last word on the treaty, that even after the treaty was signed, Grechko gave a proposal for a military alliance between India and Soviet Union, naturally turned down. But that was the Soviet Defense Ministry thinking at that time, and they had China in mind. I will touch on one more aspect, and that is with Rakesh Sood presiding. I must look at the nuclear aspect. He's the nuclear guru, and that is the guarantees that Avtar Singh mentioned in his statement also. In 1967, after the Chinese had exploded, India went in to seek nuclear guarantees from from the nuclear powers. That's saying, and according to the book, Foreign Minister Chagla, Foreign Secretary C.S. Jha, and Principal Secretary L.K. Jha, who went to Moscow, Paris, and London. Who went to Washington, I don't remember, the book doesn't say, but somebody must have gone because he must have been to all the 4 states. I remember the Moscow visit. I was posted there. The Soviets, like the others, did not agree to the nuclear umbrella for us. But as the book says, the French went a step forward and told our representative that Article 5 of the NATO agreement even prohibits them from giving assistance to a member state, member NATO state.
Automatically.
Yes, for a counterattack, I'm now quoting from what you have written in the book, for a counterattack in case a member is attacked. Now I want to give you that is where the discrepancy, and that they were not being completely faithful. When the nuclear bomb took place, I was ambassador in Germany. And I'll give a small episode there. I had just the German member of parliament had invited me and my family to the Black Forest. And before I go on a trip, I like reading take a small book with me to read. So I had a very good assistant local assistant who was a JNU scholar, a man called Xavier in the Indian embassy in Bonn. So he came and I said, any book I can take? He said, sir, a new book has come, German Bomb. I said, give it to me. That was to turn my life, that book, in a way. So I read that book completely during those days. And as I returned from the Black Forest, and the driver had just gone, I get a call from the Foreign Office, have you exploded a bomb? So I said, if it's from the Foreign Office, it couldn't be wrong. I said, I didn't want to, I said, I'll get back to you. I put down the phone and spoke to Raghunath, the Foreign Secretary. He said, yes, there's a message waiting for you. So I had just come. So I returned, my driver had gone home, we got him, went to the office. Obviously there was no message, neither any briefing for the next few days. But this book saved my life. Next day to the German Foreign Secretary, I could give him a lecture, and that's what I'll come to tell you, how it differed from what the French told our envoy in 1967 on that the Germans were doing exactly, would have done the same thing, because, a little digression, the Germans' first German foreign policy, 1954, they said they will not make the bomb in Germany. And then they decided to make a bomb with France in Sahara, and had to give up, and de Gaulle decided to do it on his own. A fact which came to public knowledge only in 1988, when the then German defense minister came with his autobiography. Anyhow, that's a point which I use in all TV programs and all. But the other 3 points which are relevant to what the French told our envoy are as follows. The Germans, when they signed the NPT, gave a statement, and it had 3 reservations. Number 1, that it would automatically, they will cease to be member if the nuclear umbrella, NATO nuclear umbrella is withdrawn. Number 2, in which case the 3 months notice which the NPT provide will not be relevant for them. And number 3, if I remember correctly, they will be allowed to do research, nuclear research in military matters. And these were confirmed 5 years later in 1974. And when the 4+2 agreement was done after the Cold War, no additional thing was done. So what I'm trying to tell you is how we were treated differently in 1967 when we went for an umbrella, and how Germany was treated around the same time, 1969. What the book has very diligently mentioned out of fact. Well, this is what I have to tell you on the book, but I'll conclude, if I have 1 minute, is that the book also reveals that Pakistan, a small nation, has deftly handled its strategic space, a limited strategic space. And its strategic policies have changed over the years, but this is not the time to go in it, because I've exceeded my time. So, and the book has complete. If in the question answer session there is, I'll intervene. But with these words, thank you, and once again, thanks to Avtar Singh ji for the book which is produced. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Once again, fascinating insights both into the Indo-Soviet treaty, the document, as he mentioned, and also in terms of the German reservations on the NPT and the differences in terms of the interpretations that we were subjected to. May I now request Professor Riaz Punjabi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I compliment Mr. Bhasin for this book. However, he has done a commendable job by compiling those 10 volumes, India-Pakistan, and now 5 more volumes on India-China relations, which provide enough research material for scholars to work on this important aspect of our foreign relations. In a lighter vein, I should say that Professor Mr. Bhasin didn't give time to researchers and scholars, because they take their own time, and he was smart enough to come out with this book mostly on the work which he has done. So thank you, Mr. Bhasin, for this book. And it also provides an Indian narrative on post-partition developments, which in most cases is missing, because we mostly depend on foreign scholars who have written on partition or post-partition developments in India. So I think that this will fill in that gap, which is very important. In fact, what we need to do is that on the basis of these documents, we need to have a holistic approach to project our developments in our country. Mr. Bhasin has, in one of the remarks, referred to Nehru, that he had a dream, although utopian dream. I don't know whether it is sarcastic or what, but I would say that he had a dream. And if you see his concepts and formulations, they continue to be relevant even after he had left the scene. When Vajpayee went to China, when he became the foreign minister, the Panchsheel, Bandhu Conference, non-alignment, all these things were brought forth by the Chinese. They had not gone into oblivion. So I think that because he had the dream of Asia, a resurgent Asia, and he was moving towards that. And I think that he partly succeeded in that. But nevertheless, when the opportunities came and he found that he's being browbeaten by countries like America, he stood his ground. I am reminded that when Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary Truman, he wrote a strong letter to Vijayalakshmi Pandit, and he was pressurizing her that India should accept McNaughton principles on Kashmir, which was division of the state and holding plebiscite in partial areas which they would define. And Nehru wrote back and wrote to Ginesh Shankar Vajpayee that they can't pressurize us like this. I reject it. So he had the courage. But one should not forget that there were forces which were working at that time on the global stage. Similarly, when Chester Bowles came as ambassador to India, he advised his government, Eisenhower had taken over, that let us be friendly to both India and Pakistan. And don't try to advise India to do this and to do that. But he got a terse reply from his foreign office. And his foreign secretary wrote to him that you should abide by the line which we give to you. The point I'm making is that there were other forces and there were other developments, and we need not to forget them. We also should keep in mind that our foreign secretary officials, with all my humility, who were handling the affairs in 50s, they had served in His Majesty's government. And to be very frank, I was shocked because now we have foreign relations with the United States which are open. They mentioned that G.S. Vajpayee was in agreement with McNaughton formula on Kashmir. And when this fact was brought to the notes of Nehru, he rejected it. Similarly, after this Indian case was referred to Security Council, and Sheikh Abdul writes in his autobiography that on the plane when he was staying with Gopalaswamy Iyengar, Iyengar gave him a note. This is a solution for Kashmir. This note read that we cannot defend Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir. It has long borders. The only solution is to keep it independent. Sheikh said, I kept quiet, I didn't say anything, but I passed it on to Nehru. However, Bhasin Saab has devoted 4 chapters on Kashmir. Otherwise, Kashmir is resurging off and on. But his complaint, he says that he holds Nehru again responsible that he had on 2 counts. One, he says that about accession. As is general perception that accession in other states was as Raja would go and say, I accede, and then Mountbatten would say, accepted, and matter finished. But sir, it is here. It is not the case of Jammu and Kashmir state. First of all, I invite your attention to Indian Constitutional Amendment Order of August 12 and August 14, which was issued by Lord Mountbatten, which gave the princes the discretion that they could amend the terms of accession, they could make it temporary, they could make it conditional, whatever. It was not a document which you read as I offer and you accept, like Muslim Nikah Nama, as they say, offer and acceptance. It was not like that. Secondly, that princely states were the problem of His Majesty's government. They had assigned this task to Mountbatten that as far as possible that these princes should be almost independent. And Mountbatten writes himself that when I came until June, I was trying to deal with the princely order. And he concluded that it would lead to the balkanization of India if I encourage the independence of these states. Therefore, he found a formula that is 3 subjects to the union, and for the rest, they would be free to choose whatever they wanted. That is how come this defense, foreign affairs, and communication thing came. And when this, he passed on to Sardar Patel, because during a meeting, when Mountbatten and Nehru, they were discussing about princely states, Mountbatten's secretary told Nehru that princes are not bound by your constitution or whatever you are doing. Nehru was very angry. He said you should be tried for malfeasance. And then that man, he resigned and left back to England. And it was on this occasion that the political department was abolished, and then you had the Department of States, of which Sardar Patel was made, it came to his charge. So when Maharaja Hari Singh signed the instrument of accession, there were annexure with that. Please mark, in that annexure, he said that I shall not be bound by the future constitution of the Dominion of India. It's written there. And there are other terms and conditions that privilege of other things, and early successes and all that. And it was accepted as such by Lord Mountbatten. Now the question remains, what about other states? I think Sardar Patel was able to convince them, telling them that I will safeguard your privileges and purses and all that. But you should remember one thing, that you will be blown off in these sharp winds of democracy, because India is going to emerge as a great democracy. So it's better that you accede or merge with India. It's how majority of the states merged with the Union of India. Now, Mountbatten had told Sardar Patel, when he said about defense, foreign affairs, and communications, is this formula acceptable to you? So Sardar Patel said that let me think about it. But Mountbatten told him, look, out of 363 apples, princely states, 360 will fall in your basket. About the 3, I will not be able to say anything. And 3 were Hyderabad, Junagadh, and Jammu and Kashmir state. And when Sardar Patel consulted Pandit Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, they said to be accepted. They accepted it. And then the later developments led to the formation of Article 370 of Constitution. It was not something which Nehru wanted to give to Sheikh Abdullah. So therefore, this misconception should go. Secondly, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee was member of parliament. When this article was being debated in the Indian parliament, he had no objection. He was a signatory to that. Only amendments moved by were Mahavir Tyagi, which were rejected by the Indian parliament. So to hold, we cannot hold Nehru responsible for this or Sheikh Abdullah. Article 350, which you have referred just now, it is linked to Art 335A. It's linked to State Subject Law of 1927. That is jobs for Kashmiris as land. It was led by Kashmiri Pandit agitation, it is known, because that was the only educated class at that time. And these Punjabis, particularly Punjabi Muslims from Lahore and Amritsar, because they had the linguistic affinity with Maharaja, they were grabbing these opportunities. And this article was, this law was passed by Hari Singh at that time. And it continued after 47. Second issue which we raised about plebiscite. What was the need about the plebiscite? Firstly, Kashmir had been taken to the United Nations. It was for UN Security Council. Secondly, when Nehru referred to plebiscite, he referred to the entire Jammu and Kashmir state, and it existed before the tribal attack from Pakistan. The problem is that when we talk about Kashmir, we almost ignore the rest of the state, because we ignore Muzaffarabad, Gilgit, Baltistan, and all that area, which is called northern areas. And ironically, when after ceasefire, Pakistan truncated this area, and this Gilgit-Baltistan area was called as northern areas, and he put it under cover for 40 long years, and only concentrated on Muzaffarabad. Now the issue is that in 47, Pakistan told the great Sudan leader Sardar Ibrahim that we are going to give you independence, you'll be an independent state. It's what they refer to some Karachi agreement. Within a year or so, they pushed him aside. Chaudhry Ghulam Abbas and other leaders, and even special status which this Kashmir enjoys, they don't enjoy it. And then, about a decade ago, a case was filed before Azad Jammu and Kashmir High Court. Justice Majid Malik gave a 500-page judgment, giving the judgment that it is an independent state and Pakistan should respect this independent state. And the Supreme Court of Pakistan annulled the judgment in one line, saying that the High Court didn't have the jurisdiction, and matter finished there. So what I am making is that these developments are to be incorporated in dealing with Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir affairs or things. You have definitely mentioned the other developments, Shimla Agreement and Tashkent Agreement, very ably in your book. But these are the facts which we need to take into consideration. And lately I was wondering that we have this late report by the UN Commission on Human Rights, Arad Hassan. So when some journalist wanted to talk to me, I said, look here, Arad Hassan is quoting all the sources from India. Our journalists, our papers, mostly from Hindu, your paper, and from our Human Rights Commission, from our judiciary, from our army tribunals judgments. So they have no locus standi, they have no cause or they have no case. But still they suddenly come with this report at this point of time. I don't have the time to go into that. And simultaneously, a report on China was being discussed because that is a 3-year report. And you should see how Chinese are answering their questions. Yes, we are doing it. Yes, we are doing that. They are not telling them what they are doing in Xinjiang, except that you have that Minar in Urumqi, that mosque, and in one corner you have these old shops. They have they have completely merged them with their society. But the UN Commission or UN Council's organs treatments to two different states are two different. And last point, as you had referred to Sheikh Abdullah's letter, which you read out. I think let us look at humanly. You had put a man whom you called Lion of Kashmir. And this Lion of Kashmir, you made a geezer of Kashmir. He lost his power. Not only lost, but he was arrested also. After 6 years or 7 years, he comes out and meets Nehru and tells us Kashmiris hate India. How did he know that they hate India? It is very important to note that in 1954, when no confidence had taken place against Sheikh, and Sheikh had been arrested, the issue of accession was discussed in the Jammu and Kashmir State Constituent Assembly. This assembly consists of 75 members. Out of 75 members, 6 had been arrested with Sheikh, 5 abstained. That means 11 didn't take part. But out of 75, 64 endorsed J&K state's accession with the Union of India. So what were the utterances of Sheikh Abdullah to Nehru? Because he was definitely a frustrated man. And by the way, when this Khan Ghaffar Khan came to India, Sheikh told him that please tell them that they should, consider. But Khan Ghaffar didn't pay any heed to that. The point I'm making is that you have done a wonderful job. I compliment you again. But we have to contextualize it with other developments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Professor Punjabi. I think another fascinating set of insights into the Nehru-Sheikh Abdullah equation and also regarding the accession and the internal politics in Kashmir at that point in time. Suhasini.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood, and thank you, Mr. Bhasin, for inviting me to this because the last half hour, 45 minutes has really told us just how much of a wealth of not just personal knowledge, but personal experience of history counts in terms of explaining to you the context, because it's so easy to, as Professor Punjabi was saying, so easy to look at one statement from a leader at a certain time and assume that that represented the reality of the people, which is why a book like Mr. Bhasin's is very important. I know that today is the day, the age of Google, but before Google, some of us got our information from something called the Encyclopedia Britannica. And the way the Encyclopedia Britannica was divided was there were 4 or 5 volumes of what was called the Micropedia, and then about 18 volumes of what was called the Macropedia. And entire universe's knowledge was inside these volumes. What you essentially did was you went to the Micropedia to look for the reference place in the larger bunch of volumes. And what Mr. Bhasin has done for all of us, and it really is a gift to readers, to students of this particular history, that he has taken the 10 volumes that he had already produced, which have the exact wordings, the exact statements, the exact archival material, and given you context for each one of them, date context, and it's more or less chronological. So it just makes it very easy when you do want to refer to any of this. And of course, he has volumes on China, which we at the Hindu look at quite often, Nepal as well. In fact, I received a message from somebody when I was saying that I was going to do this a book discussion that people in Nepal treasure those volumes as well. So I think to begin with, we should all be very grateful for the fact that these have come together and that Mr. Bhasin has now put these out in terms of, okay, if you're looking at a certain period, how are you going to approach it? What are the significant official statements and some of the letters, personal correspondence and otherwise, that you could also look at? This is the perception of the Indian establishment, I might say. Mr. Bhasin makes it very clear in his book that he comes from that perception, that this is the Indian version of what happened. I certainly hope that there will be its equivalent on the Pakistani side, and we will at some point try and match them up as well. There is Mr. Kasuri's book, of course, and there are a few other volumes. But it makes it easier for us to analyze on the basis of these because we know exactly where these are coming from. This is that perception. He gives context on several issues. In fact, I was interested that on the nuclear issues, in fact, Mr. Bhasin makes the point of how in the 1960s and up till 1974, India actually portrayed Pakistan as the rogue creator of a nuclear bomb, while India was not pursuing nuclear weapons at all until 1974. So he does bring that context in, where India has pursued a line that perhaps is not completely in line with what the history shows or the archives show, then he has pointed them out. But I think the most important part of this, and I keep coming back to this in a lot of what we're doing, is that we live in a time when little by little we are losing our institutional memory for engaging Pakistan. Ambassador Raghavan is here. He's written a wonderful book called People Like Us that tells us about the grades and the texture and the depth of the kind of communications we shared with Pakistan. Today we live in an age where those communications just don't exist. They may be there at the High Commission levels and they may be there in a few conversations, but they are not there at an institutional level. And more we are going to lose these. We are now looking at about a decade of disengagement. And your book ends in 2008 when, frankly, except for a few aborted attempts at restarting the dialogue process, we haven't gone anywhere. So we have now got a decade of officers, of diplomats, of people dealing with each other who really are looking backwards but have very little new material to go on. And so it's very important that this book ends where it does, and looks at some of the ways of engagement. So we do look at, of course, the 1950s and the 60s. We look at the Simla Agreement in very great detail, the beginnings in 1994 of the comprehensive bilateral dialogue process, and why those particular subjects were chosen at the time. Today we might say, how can you have a discussion on Siachen with Pakistan? There's no discussion. Or you can say Sir Creek, well, nobody in India really knows what that is anymore. But there was a reason why each one of these was chosen. And I think it's very important that we set clearly what we have up till today, because we really live in danger, and I can't emphasize this enough. We really live in danger of living in indifferent times to this body of work, to this body of archival history that really tells us how we once engaged with what remains a neighbor. They haven't gone anywhere in these 70 years. In particular, there are 3 or 4 parts of the book which I found interesting, and I know we don't have much time, so I'll just go quickly through them. The first, setting out the course in terms of letters, in terms of the archives of Pakistan's suspicions of India. I think in that period of 1948 to 1950, it keeps coming back, not just in what Liaquat Ali Khan said, but others as well. The idea that somehow India was, just waiting for Pakistan to collapse and become one again until, Nehru spoke at the Aligarh Muslim University and made that statement and said that even if I am giving Pakistan back today, I don't want it. And I would not agree to reunification with Pakistan. Not that that's ever convinced anyone, but it is the basis of a lot of what you hear even today. And I think we disregard a lot of the things we hear from across the border and say, this is just Pakistani rhetoric. But we have to understand so many of these things have come down in their institutional memories. So it's interesting, how Mr. Bhasin sets that period out. Two bits of hesitation, which, to be honest, I was not so well aware of. The one about Nehru saying, I'm ready to just clear Kashmir with a sword. And the fact that Mr. Bhasin has brought out the bits where Nehru fights with absolutely everyone to say, I'm not going to the United Nations with this. I refuse to go to the United Nations. And it's interesting. It's a short period, of course, and then after the UN reference, everything supposedly became history. But it was certainly interesting. And the other was the hesitation over the Soviet peace treaty, which I think Mr. Lamba has brought out so much of. In fact, I wanted to say you're the one person in this room who's referred to in the book. But the bits of hesitation and the final reason for us agreeing to sign the treaty or revisiting the treaty, because it took about 2 years before we went back to negotiations on the treaty, is fascinating, as is some of the context of where it came from. And, there's this letter that Indira Gandhi writes at the time, which is this pink one, which I thought, is interesting because now we revisit it with the Belt and Road. And here is her letter to Kosygin in 1969, where she says, the recently built road connecting Pakistan and China through Gilgit has been activated. There appears to be a considerable movement of Chinese troops in Xinjiang and in Tibet. We have naturally watched with extreme anxiety and sympathy the troubles you yourself are having with the Chinese. Undoubtedly, the Chinese will show due regard for Soviet strength and capability, but we wonder whether their failure to make any impression on the Soviet Union would not turn their thoughts towards our country. In this, there appears to be a coincidence of interest between China and Pakistan. So this is way back in 1969, but you're looking at the context. Of course, so much has changed. Today Russia and China are much closer than anyone could have thought possible, and they are connected in new ways. But in the look at the Belt and Road, it is important to read all of these points. And to end, I would like to go back to the point I was making about the fact that we have to learn the language of engagement that we have had in the past. What Mr. Bhasin's book really does compile for us is the manner of the language, the manner of the engagement, the ease of the engagement, where you have prime ministerial visits and prime ministerial meetings happening not just once a year or once in 2 years, but practically every month, some kind of communication between leaders of both sides. Somebody would drop in on his way to Dhaka, somebody would drop in on his way to Kathmandu, someone, would meet on the sidelines of a summit without there being any fanfare around it of the kind that we see today. Where even an Indus water treaty is played up in the newspapers. There's some great engagement between the two countries when you know that for 60 years it is mandated that they should meet twice a year. So we are in a new era where all of these, where the nature, as I said, the texture of the engagement is being forgotten. And it's important to remember that 70 years ago, and I will end with just this quote from what Mr. Nehru had said at the time. And he said that there is no doubt at all, this is now 1949. So, you have to think about the idea that we assume in our minds that no matter what we're doing, we're taking a step forward. Even if it is without any dialogue with Pakistan, there is an assumption in a lot of our commentariat that that is a step forward, that we are now recognizing that there's no point talking to Pakistan. In fact, we've actually gone backwards. We have, I will say, in this part of our foreign policy and our thinking of the establishment, we have gone back to places from which we have already, come out in the past. So it is a bit disheartening, but it's also interesting. So as I said, in 1949, here is what Nehru said. He said, there is no doubt at all in my mind that it is inevitable for India and Pakistan to have close relations, very close relations, sometime or in the future. He wouldn't have thought 70 years for sure. I cannot state when this will take place, but situated as we are with all our past, we cannot really be just indifferent neighbors. We can either be hostile to each other or very friendly whatever period of hostility may intervene in between, because our interests are so closely interlinked. So I'll end with that, but thank you, Mr. Bhasin, for bringing this volume up.
Thank you, Suhasini. I think the phrase that you use, the language of engagement, and how are we losing sight of it, and that reminds me that I think part of the problem is that this language of engagement is something that has eluded us. I remember in Raghavan's book, there's a particular, if I remember, Ricky Jaipal is the joint secretary, and who's the Pakistani ambassador who comes to call on him? And says, please treat us as a separate country. I don't want any of that. As foreigners, or something like that. And Ricky Jaipal says, yes, I am from South. I don't have that Punjabi business. So, that's then. So I guess the language of engagement is something that has eluded us for quite some time. Kriti, last word.
The book is an extremely important book, especially for young researchers like me, because you have hundreds of books on India and Pakistan, but this occupies a very specific and significant position amongst all those. You have books that look at the history of the country, why each country turned out the way it did, perhaps provide some policy recommendations. You have books that are more comparative analysis about trade between the two countries or water relations, nuclear progress, military power, that focuses on specific aspects. But this book is unique because it's based completely on historical fact. So it's actually enjoyable reading something that Nehru might have said and then flipping back to see that, is this actually a primary source, that actual historical fact in the MEA? And I think that's very refreshing because there's minimal reference to magazines or op-eds or other analysis in the book, and it's based on historical fact, which is much more fun to read. Some of my key takeaways is that in the book I could see that there's overwhelming evidence throughout history on how India has been advised by either Moscow or Washington or the UN to exercise massive restraint when it comes to Pakistan. And, just Pakistan should never be made to feel that India is stronger than them or superior than them. India should never appear to order Pakistan around and should sort of treat it delicately. This might have been during the beginning of the China-Pakistan military nexus, or the Shimla Agreement, or the independence of Bangladesh / division of Pakistan, whatever it is. But we've always sort of been told to, be careful, handle them delicately. And India has appeared anxious to be seen as reasonable as well, which is interesting because I mean, how much more accommodating could India have been? And Pakistan doesn't get out of their past patterns of relationships. There's a line from the book which I like, which is, Pakistan is a master of managing its own contradictions. And this can be seen in terms of other influence is during the Shimla Agreement. India was in a position of strength. You have 90,000 prisoners of war. You have occupied some territory. You have just delivered freedom to your neighbor. You have proved your military strength. The world powers are looking at India differently. But this shows that different letters, communiques, and meetings that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who had just come into power in Pakistan, had with other countries such as Moscow, even Sri Lanka, routing messages to New Delhi, convincing other powers that Pakistan has turned over a new leaf. It's a fresh start. We want to save face. And it's amazing to see how when Mrs. Gandhi and the Indian delegation reached Shimla, even though they were skeptical of Bhutto's intentions, they sort of went happy to know that Pakistan is worried because they've received this information from so many different places. In fact, the Soviet Union also hinted that Bhutto is ready in principle to consider the possibility of converting the ceasefire line to a permanent international frontier. And even though there were several drafts of the treaty that were exchanged between both sides, there's no mention or reference to Kashmir anywhere, because it was sort of assumed that that's something that Bhutto and Mrs. Gandhi would discuss. The fact that Bhutto was able to assure Mrs. Gandhi and India without giving anything in writing that it is not in India's best interest to portray Pakistan as a loser, because Pakistan has to take back and save some face, and Pakistan should not seem like it's lost because the masses would not support such an agreement. So he was able to convince Mrs. Gandhi of that, that it's not in India's interest to make Pakistan look bad. And India, desperate for peace and feeling like they did have the upper hand in the war, agreed to it. Of course, soon later, Pakistan, of course, did not accept the ceasefire line as the international boundary, and they did nothing to change their view on Kashmir. But I think that was very interesting that India went into the peace negotiations with an upper hand, but with different information. Perhaps arguably went out of the agreement with less in their hand. This is also telling in the chapter on 2611, where it just proves that Pakistan can continue to needle India and poke and prod India, but India is still constantly advised to have maximum restraint, don't do anything that would upset them. And that was one of the main things which I liked. A good half of the first book is, of course, focused on Nehru as Prime Minister, which is important because that sort of sets the foundation for how India and Pakistan relations were. It's interesting, the different letters and messages which Nehru sent his different foreign offices, where there are different words used to find a solution to the Kashmir problem. Like the professor mentioned, there's a plebiscite, he uses arbitration, he uses mediation. When a reporter asks him about the possibility of a partition, he says partition is ruled out, but there's possible that some boundaries will change. And these are all different words and they mean very different things. So not only does it show a certain indecisiveness or confusion on how to deal with it, but it also gives legitimacy to the idea that something has to be negotiated with Pakistan. And that was sort of the basis for the relationship that has continued since. I think it's a great book, sir, especially for people like me. It's a treasure trove to use in all further papers. So thank you.
Thank you, Kriti. And now the floor is open. So, please introduce yourself and yes, sir.
Thank you for giving me the first chance. I've actually got to leave, and so that's why I was making that request. I just have a comment, very brief comment, and a question. The brief comment is what has not emerged so far on Article 35A in the discussion so far, in the presentations. It doesn't begin in J&K in 1927. It doesn't begin or commence as a process in 1927, but even earlier to 1889. I think some of the younger scholars may wish to do some research on this. This is when the language of Jammu and Kashmir changed from Persian to Urdu. That's my first point. The second point is, apart from what Riaz Saab mentioned about Kashmiri Pandits having initiated, it's also the Jammu Dogras. And the two organizations which began, which spearheaded the campaign with Maharaja Hari Singh were Kashmir Pandit Sabha, based in Srinagar, in Karan and Jammu Dogra Sabha. So both these organizations are very relevant for today's narrative, that the threat was from Punjabis who would take land and jobs. And so it's not just Kashmiri Pandits, but also Dogras. My third point is that what's not been said is it's also Article 35A of the Indian Constitution is a pure replica of Section 6 of J&K Constitution, which is valid even today. So it would, obviously, any playing around with Article 35A would mean a kind of a new relationship between India's constitution and the constitution of Jammu and Kashmir. Of course, India's constitution prevails. My last point here is, in fact, two subsidiary points. The article in the Indian Constitution empowers fully, these are the words, the state of Jammu and Kashmir to pass any laws under that article without any challenge from citizens of other states on grounds of equality before law. And this is the factor which came into consideration at the Supreme Court in 1961, Sampath Prakash versus the State of India. That judgment may be read. And it was again, I forget who was the person who initiated with the State of India, again a lawsuit, where 69, the Supreme Court ruled that this is legally a valid document, therefore beyond any question. Sorry, these comments were long, but now my question, and this is both to Sati Saab and of course Mr. Avtar Singh Bhasin. My research, if you could clarify, this is a question, brings me to the conclusion that sometimes in end July or beginning of August, first 2 or 3 days, there was a rethink by the Soviet Union on proceeding ahead with the Indo-Soviet Treaty. Why do I say that? Mr. D.B. Dar is rushed to the Soviet Union, Moscow, on about the 3rd or 4th. I forget the date. Details are available in the Nehru Memorial Library. It's a top secret document, but now unclassified. And this conversation between Kosygin in the Soviet Union, I think he was the Prime Minister, and D.P. Dar is fascinating. It's perhaps as fascinating a kind of an input as the presentations which were made today. So could you clarify whether there was a rethink? Have you also come to this conclusion? Maybe Sati Saab would clarify. I came firmly to this conclusion after I read that narrative. Kosygin, D.P. Dar, 6-page. It's typed in Mr. Fotedar's typewriter. Mr. Mani would know, private secretary to D.P. Dar. It's an amazing document. That's all I want. But can you clarify, please?
You want to respond to this because he said he wants
I have to leave, yeah.
So perhaps.
No, I have no information on it.
No, first was the comments he made about.
That's not. Only
The question was about.
document, the question on the document.
6-page document. D.B. Dhar and Kosygin.
6 July, 8 July 1971, that there was a rethinking on the Soviet side, and D.P. Dhar was sent to Moscow.
Yeah. That was in reference to the war that was going on. D.P. Dhar was sent immediately when the Americans threatened that if West Pakistan is disturbed in any manner, the letter which Kennedy had issued earlier will be valid. And therefore, D.P. Dhar went to Moscow to warn, to assure the Soviet Union that we have no such intention of disintegrating West Pakistan.
No, sir, the war began on 3rd of December. I took part in that war on 3rd itself.
Yes.
We are talking about August.
Treaty.
Yes, we are talking about the treaty.
You
The
are talking
The
about
discussion was between
in July,
Foreign
first
Minister
3 days
Swaran
of
Singh
August.
and Mr. Kosygin. And Foreign Minister talked about many things, but did not talk about the treaty. Question was interested that he should ask for it and then he will reply. But Swaran Singh kept quiet until the end. When he found that question was not responding, not taking cue and giving any version, any thinking on the treaty, he then referred that he had a talk with the Koyon in the afternoon, the foreign minister, in the afternoon, in the morning rather, and therefore he has assured me all this. Question said, yes, I am very happy that you talked to him and continue with your talk and we will do something.
Thank you.
Sir.
May I ask a supplementary to Kapil's question?
Sure.
Of Sati Lamba. In a very recent lecture in southern India, Sati has given the figure of what happened in terms of demographic change in Gilgit-Baltistan after the Pakistanis removed their equivalent of 35A and allowed outsiders to buy it. He's given the figure of how the demography of Gilgit-Baltistan was dramatically changed. And if you could just comment on that, I think it would throw light on the question that is agitating everybody in Kashmir. Kapil and I were in Kashmir till yesterday, and that is something that we need to look at. I'm amazed that none of the Indian papers is talking about the kind of volcano that has built up in Kashmir over this question.
Population of the Shias and the Ismailis taken together in Gilgit-Baltistan, which Pakistan calls northern areas, was, if I remember correctly, over 80% in 1947 and is now reduced to 50%. And during this period, the Sunni population has increased. This was done because Zia had changed the law and he encouraged people from the then Northwest Frontier Province, now called to come and stay there so that the Sunni Shia ratio could be changed. That was the only region besides two areas in Fatah where the Shias were in a majority.
Sir, I am Keshav Jha from Jamia Millia Islamia. Ambassador Lamba made a important point from the book that despite Pakistan's size and population, Pakistan, since its history, made its space in strategically in the world order very smartly. So, which type of strategic space you were talking about? A second thing, my question is for Basin sir. That every time we listen that. Pakistan is run by army, but it's quite difficult to run a country has ethnicity contradictions, very much problems. So army cannot control these problems. So who actually runs the Pakistani society? Because if Pakistan has to run, you have to control the ethnicity, these problems. Thank you, sir.
My question is, well, that's all very well what happened in the past. It's all very well what happened in the past, and thank you to Avtar for having told us what happened in the past. But where do we go now?
We have to search for the language of engagement that's Suhasini.
You as a politician have to tell us where we have to go. Integral part of India. On the other hand, we always say to Pakistan, we're willing to talk to you on any subject, including Kashmir. Does this not give the impression to the Kashmiris that their future is still not settled?
The Sati Lamba has demonstrated, along with Tariq Aziz of Pakistan, that it is possible to talk Kashmir to the Pakistanis, with the Pakistanis maintaining that Jammu Kashmir is an inalienable part of Pakistan, and we maintaining that this is all an inalienable part of India, and still talk and arrive at a constructive 4-point formula which is ready to be converted into an agreement. So I believe that it would be very wrong of India to give up its position even before talking. They maintain their position, we maintain our position, and then we talk. And when we talk, then we don't keep repeating these cliches of the past. We move forward.
Sir, it was a formula, not an agreement. And both the government yet to accept it, parliament has to accept it, the political parties have to arrive at a consensus.
Whoever is the government will find the majority to get that parliamentary resolution revoked, suspended, or whatever. So I don't see that as an insuperable objection at all. The problem is the government of India doesn't want it. And the problem was, and looking very quickly through your chapter headings, it doesn't seem to me that you have taken into account the fact that the current dispensation is creating a salience between Pakistan and Muslims, and as part of their domestic agenda of discriminating against Muslims, they found a lovely word to describe the Muslims. The word is Pakistan.
It's a political issue. You are better positioned to comment. I am nobody.
No politician to answer that.
चलो बंद करो जी.
Any,
बस
any last comments?
No
Sir,
comments.
you want to respond to, clarify anything? नहीं, उनको भी मौका मिलेगा, ऐसी बात नहीं.
Just 2 or 3 points. One is that despite the Parliament resolution which was passed in 1993, there have been negotiations. So I don't think so the resolution is a hindrance to negotiation. The man who the resolution was passed during the tenure of Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, and he himself was encouraging discussions. I was the High Commissioner in Pakistan when he was Prime Minister, and he was all for discussion. So I don't think so the resolution in any way comes in the way of discussions or engagement. Well, I think I am one of those who feel there should be engagement, and all over the world there is engagement. And engagement is particularly necessary with the hostile neighbor. Even more, so that he can be kept in check and you can understand what he's saying and convey your views rather than doing it through third party. And I won't annoy Suhash, or I said despite just going by media views. She agrees. One point you mentioned about what I said was that Pakistan had limited strategic space, and they made very good advantage of that since 1947. They were with their location and the Islamic content which they gave to it, whenever it suited them, they have taken advantage of it for their own good. Whether they joined a military alliance, whether they became subservient to another foreign power, but they managed to exist. Because if you see media reports, each time there is an IMF, they have to go, the report is this is the end of Pakistan, but it's never been the end. They manage, and even this time, I think the Americans will also help them eventually. Yeah.
So, I have a question.
No. You can have, check after, around tea, over tea.
It is not on all the issues that OIC supports Pakistan. In 1994, when Pakistan brought a resolution against India on Kashmir, it could not get through because there was no consensus in OIC about that resolution. That's number one. Number two, about Gilgit-Baltistan, I doubt this, if there was a law at all. It was from the very beginning that they would encourage Pathans and Pashtuns to come and settle down in Gilgit. But they had kept that area beyond discussion or within the purview of media. And there have been massacres of Gilgit Shias, Balti Shias. And even today, China is now telling Pakistan that if you can't defend this territory, let us take the defense of that area. Last issue, the point I want to make is that this bus service between Srinagar and Rawalakot, it is, I think, one step towards reconciliation and towards mediation. And if this experiment is repeated in Ladakh and on the other side, and this goes on, then as you say, the language of engagement, I think this will encourage that.
Thank you. You want to say something?
No, I think I made my last comments.
Okay, then it remains for me to thank Bhasin Saab for having given us this book, and also thank Ambassador Lamba, Professor Punjabi, Suhasini, and Kriti, and all of you for joining us this afternoon. May I now invite you for a cup of tea in the room next door.
And also all of you who have taken time to come here, thank you very much.